efforts, you may not be back here in the United States Congress. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio.
I ask to speak for up to 10 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, the House of Representatives is voting on legislation dealing with Farm Bill and food stamps. Recently, this week, the House of Representatives broke with 40 years of tradition, precedent, common sense, and perhaps human decency when it bowed to partisan politics and passed a Farm Bill without a nutrition title. They pulled apart what traditionally urban and rural interests have done in this country, coming together to pass a farm bill, connecting it with a nutrition title, where it served rural America, it served urban America, it served hungry kids. It was good for hungry kids, it was good for economic development, it was good for conservation and the environment. The House leadership has announced that later today, sometime this afternoon, the House will vote on a bill that would cut the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, by nearly $40 billion. They're taking this bill up because the $20 billion in punitive SNAP cuts that they failed to pass earlier this year wasn't enough for the majority. And they don't only cut $20 billion, $20 billion, $20,000 million, $20 billion in cuts when the average family gets $4.45 per day. Cutting $20 billion was bad enough. That wasn't good enough for those members of the House of Representatives who want to see cuts twice as big. Many of those members of the House of Representatives, or at least some of them, are farmers themselves who get huge farm subsidies. It begs the issue a little bit. For some of my colleagues have seen the movie Lincoln. One point, President Lincoln, at listening but perhaps not entirely hearing his staff, who exhorted him to spend more time in the White House, winning the war, freeing the slaves, preserving the Union, President Lincoln said, I need to go out and get my public opinion baths. Well, I suggest that maybe more of us, those particularly that are voting to cut SNAP, to cut food stamps, $40 billion, they may want to go out and listen to what people not dressed like this, not working around here, that get good benefits and decent salaries, not highly paid congressmen and senators, not the lobbyists that they may brunch with on Sunday when those members don't go back home, but go out and talk to somebody at a union hall, go out and talk to somebody in a shopping mall, go out and talk to somebody in a school where children, I heard stories today at my weekly coffee where a woman teaching in Columbus told us that a woman whose daughter teaches in Columbus told us that on the school lunch program that she has seen children take some of the food and put it in their pockets so they can take home to their brothers and sisters or for the weekend or for their mom or dad. So when I see in this still difficult economy, when people receive $4.45 per day on the average for SNAP, for food stamps, people in the House of Representatives want to cut nearly $40 billion. It wasn't enough that 2 million Americans could lose SNAP benefits. It wasn't enough to them in the first bill that more than 200,000 children could lose access to the free and reduced price lunch program. They want to make it harder, and they can say whatever they want. They can say that, well, people, I don't know, do they get addicted to food stamps? They dig food stamps because they don't want to work. Well, the fact is, as Chairwoman Stabenow points out, the chair of the Agriculture Committee, in the next 10 years, 14 million Americans will leave the SNAP program. Why is that if we don't do this? Why will 14 million people leave the SNAP program? Because they'll get better paying jobs, because they don't want to be in the SNAP program. Most people that get food stamps would rather not. They'd rather have enough food on the table. They'd rather have enough purchasing power to go to the grocery store and buy food with their own money that they've earned so they can bring that food home and serve their children. That's what most people want to do. I spoke to a woman in Hamilton, Ohio some time ago who told me that early in the month, she would take her son, her 9-year-old son, occasionally would take him to McDonald's or take him to a fast food restaurant, maybe once the first week in the month. Second week, she could maybe serve him a hamburger. She could serve him meat. Third week of the month, she began to scrape. This is a woman that had a full-time job, volunteered taught Sunday school, volunteered with the Cub Scouts for her son, was a very devoted single mother. Fourth week of the month, what typically happened is she looked at me in her blue eyes and she said, you know, I say to my son, I'm sitting there with my son that last week of the month, and he says, Mom, how come you aren't eating? And she said, well, I'm just not hungry. Well, she was hungry. She just had to choose with the end of the month, does the money go for my son or does it go for me? And like most mothers and fathers, they choose to do it for their children. I mean, that's the backdrop of this. If more of my colleagues would follow the admonition of Abraham Lincoln and go out and get a public opinion bath and listen to what real people were saying, not people that dress like this, not people that sit in Congress, not lobbyists that may buy them lunch and come to their fundraisers, but really listen to what people have to say about what this means. And understand, Mr. President, as you know, and the work you've done in your state of Connecticut, how most of these people getting benefits are children. 85% of people receiving food assistance are children or their parents or people with disabilities or seniors. And many of them have jobs, but their jobs pay $9 an hour. Again, this isn't something they do by choice in the great majority of cases. It's something that they feel they have to do. They're mothers and fathers who get up in the morning trying to give their children a better future. It's the millions of Americans who head out every day looking for work so they can pay their bills and put food on the table. As I said, almost 90%, 80-some% of SNAP households are made up of seniors and the disabled and families with children. 1 out of 6 Americans worry about where their next meal is coming from. 1 out of 6 Americans. How many people in this body have ever really thought that way, have talked to people that way, have tried to put themselves in the place of somebody? As 15, 16, 17% of Americans, 1 out of 6 worry where their next meal comes from. And then we have the body down the hall, the House of Representatives, who vote it's just not enough. $20 billion in cuts isn't enough. Let's do $40 billion. Maybe we'll do more than that. My colleagues in the Congress suggest that SNAP participation has grown too big. They bemoan the state of our economy, the still too high unemployment rate. We all do. I share that concern. But we must do more to help jumpstart the economy. I'll work with anyone who seeks to do so. Mr. President, we know how important these benefits are to our brothers and sisters from Cleveland to Cincinnati, from rural Appalachia to farmlands in western Ohio, all across this country. It's important that we stand strong on this. We need a farm bill. We need a farm bill that serves agriculture. We need a farm bill that serves rural development. We need a farm bill that serves conservation in the environment. We need a farm bill that helps us provide energy, and we need a farm bill that provides nutrition assistance. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate receives H.A. Res. 59 from the House, the measure be placed on the calendar with a motion proceed not in order until Monday, September 23rd.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Under the previous order, the Energy Committee is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 527, and the Senate will proceed to the immediate consideration of the bill, which the clerk will report.
H.R. 527, an act to amend the Helium Act to complete the privatization of the Federal Helium Reserve and so forth and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, substitute amendment 1960 is agreed to. Under the previous order, there will be 15 minutes of debate equally divided between the senator from Oregon, Mr. Wyden, and the senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz, or their designees. Who yields time?
Mr. President, as I said,
Senator from Oregon.
President, as I said this morning, Washington, D.C. seems to have an inexhaustible capacity to manufacture false crises. I'm here to say this is not one of them. If the Congress does not act immediately to pass the legislation that Senator Murkowski and I advanced today, scores of American manufacturing and technology companies employing millions of American workers are going to find it impossible to continue their current operations. Our government got involved with helium after World War I because the defense sector needed it. Ever since, president after president, Congress after Congress has tried to come up with a policy that gets government out of the helium business while still meeting the needs of our middle-class workers, our businesses, and our taxpayers. Senator Murkowski and I are here to say that our bipartisan bill does that. The reality also is it raises some revenue. With that revenue, we are able to meet, and we talked about it in the committee, ongoing needs, particularly for folks hurting in rural communities where the federal government owns most of the land. They're concerned about their schools and their police and their roads. And because of the good work by colleagues on the other side of the aisle, particularly Senators Risch and Flake, we are able to secure an additional $51 million to pay down the deficit. We have 7 minutes on each side. I know colleagues are anxious to vote. I'd like to yield time to Senator Murkowski. I thank Senator Cruz for his courtesy in this matter, and I would yield at this time to Senator Murkowski. And I'd urge all colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this legislation that came out of our committee unanimously.
Senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the chairman of our Energy Committee. We've been working on this legislation for some time now, a couple years. And as the chairman has noted, what we're doing with the reauthorization of this helium program is we're getting the government out of the business of helium. We are on our way to complete a process that has been underway effectively in Congress since 1996. And so we have an opportunity today to do the right thing, but we also have a very clear opportunity to make sure that we don't have a helium crisis, that we don't see a disruption in supply. And that's effectively what could happen if we here in the House don't act quickly, work with the Senate to get this resolved before an October 1 deadline. So the imperative of taking this vote here this afternoon, moving it across the line here so that we can conclude our business as it relates to the helium program, this is significant. It's important. We have a chance, again, to make a difference here. We can prevent a massive disruption to the helium supply chain. We recognize that when we're talking about helium, it's not just party balloons. We are talking truly about impact to our high-tech sector, our manufacturing center, so many sectors of our economy that are reliant and dependent on helium. We should also, again, finish the business that we started back in 1996, fully privatize the helium business so that the government is out of the way and that truly what we're doing is helium supplies are determined by market forces. And as the chairman has noted, we need to address other priorities here in the Congress. We have done that with the revenues and the distribution that the chairman has outlined, that I have outlined previously here on the floor, and at the same time seen fit to direct a good portion of revenues towards deficit reduction. These are good, responsible decisions. Our program, or our legislation here in the Senate differs from what our counterparts in the House have done. Again, we end the government's intervention or activities within the helium business. We've got a thoughtful glide path out. It's legislation that, again, is not only thoughtful, it's bipartisan. It moved through the Energy Committee unanimously, and I'm pleased to be able to stand here today with the Chairman of the Energy Committee urging colleagues to support this critically important legislation. With that, I would yield the floor.
I thank my colleague from Alaska and particularly for all of the work. We await our colleague from Texas who would like to speak. How much time remains on our side, Mr. President?
2.5 minutes.
Let me yield 1 minute at this time to our friend who in the House has begun working on this literally years ago, and we thank him for all of his efforts. The distinguished Senator from Massachusetts.
Senator from Massachusetts. I thank the Senator from Oregon. This bill is something that shows that the government can work, that we can work across the lines of politics in this institution. I began this bill with Doc Hastings, Republican from Washington State, in the House of Representatives a year ago. It passed over there. Now it's over here in the Senate, and the same kind of bipartisanship is working together to pass this critical bill, which is central for companies like Siemens and Philips and GE and just in Massachusetts that support thousands of jobs in the high-tech sector. There is a shutdown that was looming, but it was a shutdown in the helium industry. This is one shutdown that we're going to make sure doesn't happen. And I just want to thank you for making this possible, because it took a lot of leadership to make sure that the House bill, the Hastings-Markey bill, is now over here and it's resolved in a way which every member should feel very comfortable in voting yes for, because it really is going to solve a big problem that was going to hit our high-tech industry in the United States. I thank the gentleman.
President, I believe we have 1.5 minutes left. Let's have Senator Cruz, and hopefully then we can vote.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'm going to be brief and not take my entire time. I think the underlying extension and reform of the helium program in this bill is a good provision. It maintains the program. Helium is critical for our business, for our industry, for our high-tech community, and so I salute the Senator from Oregon, the Senator from Alaska for working together on this. As written, this Senate bill raises $500 million over 10 years in new revenue. The House bill took the revenue raised by this program and put it to deficit reduction and reducing our debt. The Senate bill, I think, unfortunately, instead of using the revenue for deficit reduction, uses $400 of the $500 million to new spending. I raised internally an objection and asked my colleagues if they could consider reducing spending in other parts of the budget to balance it, given that we have nearly a $17 trillion national debt. I think the more fiscally responsible thing to do is, if we have $500 million in new revenue, to use it to pay down the deficit and pay down the debt. We have worked together in a bipartisan way to allow this to come to a vote. I thank the Senator from Oregon for agreeing to do that. I intend to vote no, but I'm hopeful in conference committee perhaps the House and Senate can work together to take care of the important concerns with the helium program, but at the same time demonstrate some additional fiscal responsibility, which I think would be a win-win for everyone.
Mr. President, we have 1.5 minutes. I'll be really brief. I thank the Senator from Texas for his courtesy. The bottom line here is the House bill, which the Senator is calling for, does not get the government out of the helium business. That is the single most important distinction. We are reaching out to all those hard-hit middle-class workers in aerospace and tech and a whole host of industries. We're doing it in a way that protects taxpayers. It gets the government out of the helium business. This legislation passed the Energy and Natural Resources Committee unanimously. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I ask consent, Mr. President, all time be yielded back, and the Senate now proceed to vote on passage of the bill as amended.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
H.R. 527, an act to amend the Helium Act to complete the privatization of the Federal Helium Reserve and so forth and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Thanks.
Hey, Dave.
Mr. Manchin. Bennett. Sir. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Aye. Gotcha. Sure. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. You got my list. Yes, I did. Thanks. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Sir. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
I don't know.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Begich, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Corker, Crapo, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heinrich, Hirono, Isaacson, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, McConnell, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Vitter, Warner, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Cruz voted in the negative. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Chiesa, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Moran. Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Paul. Yes. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Shelby? Aye.
For all your help. Is this you too?
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 97, the nays are 2. The bill as amended is passed. Senator from Indiana.
I ask that unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business until 5 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I am here today with my colleague from Missouri, Senator Blunt, to talk about our efforts to bring some common sense to the EPA's emission standards. It is my firm belief that we can establish emission standards that protect our environment without hurting our economy and without hurting the pocketbooks of families in Indiana and across the country. When the EPA released draft standards in 2012 that would regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, it was clear that the administration's standards far exceeded the level of carbon reductions that would be available using existing technology. They also failed to acknowledge that different fuel types pose different challenges when trying to reduce emissions. If we don't address these standards in a common-sense way, the affordable, reliable energy that Hoosier families and businesses depend on is in doubt. It is absolutely critical that the EPA understand the impact of these standards and the price their proposed regulation would ask Hoosiers to pay. Our amendment urges the EPA to use common sense when putting together emissions regulations by ensuring that efforts to regulate carbon dioxide emissions are realistic about existing technology and do not negatively impact our economy. Our amendment states that if the EPA puts together regulations to control carbon dioxide emissions from an industrial source, the EPA must develop the regulations using emission rates based on the efficiencies achievable using existing technology that is commercially available. Commercially available is defined as any technology with proven test results in an industrial setting. It also must be subcategorized by fuel type. Different fuel types must have different emission rates to be reflective of what is realistic for fuel producers using all available technologies. Our amendment develops an NSPS for carbon dioxide emissions to protect our environment, while also ensuring that the regulations do not excessively burden Hoosier families and businesses that rely on affordable power. The EPA is scheduled to release their updated standards tomorrow. I urge them to make sure that any NSPS regulation is something that reflects existing technology. We must prevent anything that would jeopardize the affordable, reliable energy that allows many Hoosier families and families across our country and businesses across our country to make ends meet. Again, I thank my friend Senator Blunt for his work with me on this issue.
Missouri.
Let me say I'm pleased to work on this with Senator Donnelly. This is an amendment that, as he said, requires that we categorize fuel types, that we say what works for various types of fuel as opposed to set some standard that makes it impossible for other resources we have not to be used. It says that the technology has to be commercially available. We had the acting EPA director before the Appropriations Committee earlier this year, and I just asked the acting director, is this rule that you're talking about, is this technology available? Can somebody go out and buy this? And the response was something like, well, the parts of it are out there, but nobody's ever quite put it together yet, which of course meant that the rule for the first time ever set a standard that couldn't possibly be reached. And in states like our states, in states like Missouri and Indiana, where I'm from and where Senator Donnelly's from, you know, we're 80%, more than 80% dependent on coal. Some of our constituents are 100% dependent on coal. And if you do things that raise those utility bills, they know it and their families know it and their community knows it. This amendment simply would force the EPA to use common sense when setting standards for any facility. The new source performance standards based upon admission limits for power plants, for refineries, for manufacturing facilities, for whatever else they can cover, just simply don't meet that common sense standard. In fact, last March when the proposed rule went out, there were more than 2 million comments. Now, you've got to work pretty hard to find this rule, and you've got to really be dedicated to read it. And 2 million comments that said this won't work. It is so obvious it won't work. The rule said that if someone wants to build a coal plant, they have to install carbon capture technology, which, according to the rule, would add 80% to the cost of electricity. 80% to the cost of electricity. Now, it would overstate it a little bit initially, but not very far in the future. If you just got your utility bill and multiplied it by 2, you're pretty close to what your utility bill would be if the proponents of this rule believe, really, if what they say will happen is what would happen. Now, what happens if you double the utility bill? How many jobs go away? How many families find themselves in stress. When cap and trade failed, the president, who'd said earlier that under his cap and trade plan, electric rates would necessarily skyrocket. When it failed, the president said, well, that was only one way of skinning the cat. Obviously, the EPA is looking for the second way to skin this cat and to impact families. It would make it expensive to do what can be otherwise done in the country. Businesses and households would need to make a decision about that. You know, what we need to be doing is look for using all of our resources in the best possible way. More American energy is a critical thing, and we ought to be doing everything we can to see how we produce more American energy, a more certain supply, easier to transition from one fuel to another, not harder, not putting one electric plant out of business and requiring that you build an entire new electric plant. You know how you pay for an electric plant is somebody gives you the authority to pass all that cost along to the people who are served by it. There's no free electricity out there, and it makes a real difference. When families look at this, you know, the most vulnerable families among us are the ones that are most impacted by the higher utility bill. The Bureau of Labor Statistics said that nearly 40 million American households earn less than $30,000 a year, and in those households they spend almost 20% of their income on energy. Well, you want to make that 30% or 40%? Surely that is not the answer for vulnerable families. The EPA, if you read press reports today, will come out with a rule tomorrow. I hope that this amendment would become part of the law that would make that rule, frankly, Madam President, make common sense. The American people want the administration to stop picking winners and losers through the regulatory policies. If the Congress wants to have that debate and change the law and do that in the open, that's one way to do it. But I think we all know that American consumers have figured out where this road takes their family, and they don't want to go there. So I urge support of the amendment that Senator Donnelly and I are working on. Common sense and real cost-benefit analysis. New standards that work are essential, not new standards that you know won't work. I'm glad to be a co-sponsor of this amendment and urge my colleagues to join Senator Donnelly and I if we get a chance to vote on it as part of this bill. And I would notice the absence of a quorum.